The wails of lamentation from a neighboring kingdom submerged in natural disaster were never merely a matter of simple compassion in the eyes of ancient monarchs. On the contrary, they were always the starting signal for a sophisticated game of power. When storms and floods ravaged harvests, or earthquakes swallowed strongholds across the border, a seasoned king would immediately issue a poignant imperial edict. He would call upon his subjects to open their hearts in mercy, contributing rice and silver to aid their destitute neighbors. In the eyes of the poor, this was the pinnacle of humanitarianism. But viewed through the lens of the art of statecraft, this was, in fact, a series of perfect traps. It was designed to strip domestic wealth, enslave neighbors, and fortify the throne for thousands of miles. In an era of swords and spears, kindness was rarely dispensed without an exorbitant price tag. The most pragmatic aspect of this relief campaign was the art of extracting wealth from subjects without expending a single arrow or stone. Any royal court craved a full treasury, but raising taxes without cause always risked inciting rebellion. Peasants might endure hunger, but they would take up arms if they saw their final bowl of rice snatched away to serve the luxury of the nobility. How then could more taxes be collected, while the populace remained submissively compliant, or even offered them up with tears of pride? The answer lay in borrowing another tragedy to erect a moral stage. When the relief edict was issued alongside praises of friendship and the mandate of heaven, the sovereign skillfully cloaked a tax order in a brilliant shroud of morality. This maneuver stripped the people of their only weapon of resistance, which was righteous indignation. If a man refused to surrender grain to feed the army, he might be seen as courageously resisting oppression. But if he refused to surrender grain to save dying children across the border, he instantly became a cruel, selfish wretch acting against the will of heaven. Ancient monarchs understood the power of public opinion all too well. They used communal pressure to force even the most stubborn to open their purses. Thus, grain, cloth, and silver flowed in succession into the imperial storehouses. But what percentage of that massive fortune actually crossed the border to reach the hands of the destitute? That was a secret known only to the classified ledgers within the palace. A small portion was paraded ostentatiously on convoys, accompanied by flags and gongs for the public to admire. The vast majority quietly flowed into the royal treasury. It transformed into bounties for guards, gold ingots for trusted officials, or lay dormant in subterranean vaults in preparation for future conquests. Neighboring aid, in the final analysis, was a form of the most brutal taxation, executed under the gentlest of guises. Beyond draining the commoners, the relief edict was also a treacherous test of loyalty aimed at the local nobility. When the order for donations descended, the gaze of the throne was immediately pinned upon the manners of the lords. How much they gave, how quickly or slowly, and their overall demeanor were all recorded by secret agents without missing a single detail. A lord who emptied his granaries to answer the king call would be granted a hollow title, but in reality, his economic potential was decimated, leaving him without enough provisions to maintain a private army. Conversely, anyone who hesitated or contributed little would immediately be branded a traitor. The call for mercy thus became a sword at the throat, forcing powerful officials to surrender their wealth if they wished to keep their lives. The one sitting on high simultaneously amassed riches, weakened the wings of his subordinates, and gained a pretext to purge seeds of opposition under the guise of punishing apathy. Turning to the second objective, the neighboring kingdom exhausted by disaster. Sending relief was never a free gift. In the game of power, every gift is a shackle. A chain made of rice during a time of famine is sturdier than one made of iron. When the rival king humbly accepted the provisions, he did not merely accept life for his people, he slipped a collar of devastating moral debt around his own neck. In ancient diplomacy, a debt of silver could be repaid with land, but a debt for the lives of an entire nation could only be repaid with eternal submission. The court dispensing the aid immediately stood in the position of the ultimate benefactor. They bought political concessions at a pittance. Unfair trade treaties began to be signed under the name of friendship. Border territories disputed for 100 years were suddenly and voluntarily ceded in gratitude. The neighboring kingdom was even forced to become a living shield, destined to take the first spear should an enemy invade. The king receiving the aid understood this entanglement perfectly, yet he could not refuse. Between immediate collapse and bowing as a vassal to survive, the weak must always choose the latter. The kindness of the strong is a honey-coated poison. Though the weak know it will tear their insides, they must still swallow it whole to quench their immediate thirst. The cold precision of statecraft also lay in the fact that grain convoys always carried hidden blades. They served as the eyes, ears, and intelligence networks that intervened deeply into the opponent's internal affairs. There was no opportunity more perfect for mapping terrain, scouting mountain passes, and assessing the decay of a rival army than by dispatching a relief mission. The ragged porters could be elite cavalry in disguise. The scribes were, in fact, seasoned spies using hawk-like eyes to record every fatal weakness of the host nation. They marched with dignity through strictly guarded city gates under the warm welcome of their very future enemies. Even more subtle, this food was a weapon to bribe the hearts of the people and subvert their loyalty. Instead of handing everything over to the neighboring court for distribution, the relief mission would find ways to dispense it directly to local lords or the poor. This act was an invisible blade, severing the bond between the foreign king and his subjects. Desperate citizens would no longer revere their own helpless monarch. They would only kneel in gratitude for the benevolence of the foreign king who saved their lives. By sowing seeds of rice, the benefactor silently nurtured a coup from within. When the time was right, only a small spark was needed for those indebted to be ready to throw open the city gates for a foreign army, fueled by the naive belief that they were welcoming a sage ruler acting on behalf of heaven. Finally, a masterstroke of psychological warfare hidden behind the relief edict was aimed at the king-owned subjects. Power is only stable when the people feel their lives are secure, and satisfaction always stems from comparison with the misery of others. When the king forced his people to gather resources for the neighbor, he was forcing them to witness the horrific tragedy beyond the border. Domestic subjects might be living in poverty and paying taxes year-round, but when they heard of neighboring throngs in tattered rags, eating grass due to the floods, their psychology shifted instantly. Resentment over high taxes and heavy labor suddenly vanished, replaced by a sense of fortune. They felt grateful for still having a roof to shield them from the rain and a bowl of porridge to line their stomachs. Most importantly, they believed that their great imperial court was protecting them from a similar catastrophe. Allowing the poorest to have the right to pity foreigners was a perfect anesthetic. It created an illusion of nobility and superiority in the minds of peasants who spent their lives toiling in the dirt. While immersed in the delusion of their own kindness and the strength of their nation, they would completely forget the shackles of oppression upon their own shoulders. The king did not need to use swords to quash resistance. He only needed to place before his people a mirror reflecting the despair of others. Under the ruthless operation of the ancient machinery of rule, no edict was written out of simple pity, and no grain of rice left without calculation. The monarchs transformed the collapse of a neighbor into a masterpiece of power manipulation. They nonchalantly gathered the wealth of their people under a shroud of morality and broke the morale of the nobility with tests of loyalty. They enslaved neighboring dynasties with a debt of life and death, planted spies, and sowed the seeds of rebellion right in the midst of tearful aid ceremonies. And most sophisticatedly, they lulled all domestic discontent to sleep with a grand spectacle of compassion. When the praises of a benevolent dynasty echoed through every corner and alleyway, that was also the moment when invisible yokes were tightened several notches further. Were those grain-laden convoys rumbling across the border truly the embodiment of life? Or were they, in fact, perfectly disguised hearses slowly approaching to bury the final sovereignty of a weak and weary dynasty?